Welcome to the Terror Time.
The first story is about the vanishing of Emily Graves. It was a cold winter night when Emily Graves disappeared. She was last seen leaving a small family gathering, heading home on foot, just a short walk through the neighborhood. Emily had taken that route countless times before, but this time, something felt different. Her sister, who had watched her leave, remembered how the wind seemed to howl as Emily disappeared into the night, her silhouette fading into the fog. Hours passed, but Emily never made it home. The town launched a search the next morning. Friends, family, and local authorities scoured the streets, the woods, and the nearby fields, but there was no sign of her. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding Emily alive dwindled. What made things even more unsettling was the fact that she had vanished without a trace. No footprints, no personal belongings left behind, just gone as if the earth had swallowed her whole. It wasn't until a month later that someone found her. The discovery happened purely by accident. A group of teenagers had ventured into the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place notorious for its creepy reputation. The cemetery was ancient, overgrown with weeds, and filled with crumbling headstones so old the names were barely legible. The locals called it the Forgotten Graveyard, and many avoided it, claiming the place was haunted. The teens had wandered too far, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows among the graves. That's when one of them spotted it, something out of place. In the far corner of the cemetery, lying face down near a weathered tombstone, was a body. It was Emily. She was curled up, her clothes torn and covered in dirt, as though she had clawed her way out of the earth itself. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, but her expression was peaceful, almost serene. Yet something about her death didn't make sense. She had been missing for over a month, but her body showed no signs of decay. The news of her discovery sent chills through the town. How had she ended up in the cemetery? There was no evidence that she had been there the entire time. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on her body, just the lingering feeling that something was deeply wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. I had known her for years, and the idea of her disappearing like that, only to be found in such a creepy place, kept me up at night. It wasn't just the unsolved mystery of her death that haunted me, it was the cemetery itself. I had been there once, years ago, and something about that place had always felt off. I decided to go back to the cemetery. Maybe it was a bad idea, but I needed answers. I needed to know if there was something more to Emily's disappearance. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep shade of purple as shadows stretched across the ground. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. As I walked among the graves, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the old iron gate set my heart racing. The cemetery was unnervingly still, as if the very ground beneath me was holding its breath. I found the spot where Emily's body had been discovered, marked by a faint disturbance in the earth. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, as if something was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, without a doubt, that Emily's death hadn't been natural. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a soft rustling like footsteps moving through the grass. I spun around, but no one was there. The cemetery was empty, just as it had been when I arrived, but the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow, a figure standing between two graves, barely visible in the fading light. It was tall, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. My skin prickled with fear as the figure stepped forward, revealing its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its features were blurred, indistinct, as if it were a mere echo of something long forgotten. I stood frozen, unable to move as the shadow glided toward me. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel its presence closing in, oppressive and suffocating. This wasn't just a ghost story, this was real. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. My legs trembled as I took a step back, but the figure remained, watching, waiting. A deep sense of evil emanated from it, something far darker than I had ever encountered before. I knew then that this was no ordinary spirit. This was something much worse, something supernatural. Suddenly, the figure lunged at me. I stumbled backward, crashing into a gravestone as the shadow rushed toward me like a predator closing in on its prey. My heart pounded in my ears, and I scrambled to my feet, running as fast as I could toward the cemetery gates. The wind howled around me, and I could hear faint whispers, voices carried on the wind, but I didn't stop to listen. I didn't stop running until I was far from the cemetery, gasping for breath, my heart still racing in my chest. I looked back, half expecting to see the shadow following me, but there was nothing, just the distant outline of the cemetery, shrouded in darkness. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the shadow is still out there, waiting. Emily's death wasn't just an accident, and I'm certain that whatever took her is still lurking in that cemetery, searching for its next victim. The second story is about the graveyard of lost souls. It was a quiet evening when Lucas went missing. He had been out with friends at a nearby bar, celebrating his new job. The last anyone saw of him, he was leaving the bar alone, walking toward his apartment just a few blocks away. It was a route he'd taken countless times, but this time something went terribly wrong. When Lucas didn't show up for work the next day, his friends began to worry. Calls to his phone went unanswered, and when they visited his apartment, there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police were called, and a search began, but days passed with no leads, no clues. Lucas had simply disappeared. Weeks later, his body was found in an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place no one had any reason to visit. The cemetery was long abandoned, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. It was known by locals as the Graveyard of Lost Souls, a name that only added to its creepy allure. I remember the day they found Lucas. His body was discovered by a groundskeeper who had been clearing some brush near the back of the cemetery. Lucas was lying near an ancient mausoleum, his clothes dirty and torn, his skin pale as death itself. But what made the discovery even more disturbing was the look on his face. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of pure terror. The news of Lucas's death sent shockwaves through the town. Everyone was talking about how he had ended up in the cemetery, a place he had no connection to. The police had no answers, and the coroner's report was inconclusive. There were no signs of foul play, no injuries that could explain his death. It was as if something had scared him to death. I knew Lucas. We had been close friends for years, and his death hit me hard. I couldn't stop thinking about how he had ended up in that cemetery. The idea that he had been alone, terrified, in his final moments haunted me. I needed to know what had happened, even if the truth was too horrific to face. That's when I decided to visit the cemetery myself. It was a stupid decision, I know that now. But at the time, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something the police had missed, something lurking in that cemetery that had taken Lucas's life. I arrived just before sunset, the sky a dull gray, casting long shadows over the crumbling tombstones. The air was heavy, the kind of suffocating stillness that makes your skin prickle. I walked through the overgrown paths, the weeds tugging at my ankles as I made my way toward the mausoleum where Lucas had been found. The place was haunted. I could feel it in my bones. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees made my heart race. When I reached the mausoleum, I stopped. The stone structure loomed in front of me, its once grand facade now cracked and crumbling. The door was slightly ajar, and for a moment I considered turning back, but something compelled me to step closer, to peer into the darkness within. As I approached, I felt a sudden chill, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the air around me grew thick with an oppressive energy. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the whisper was gone as quickly as it had come. I stood there, frozen in place, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted between the tombstones, too fast for me to get a good look. My body stiffened and chills ran down my spine as I scanned the cemetery, but there was no one there. Or so I thought. Suddenly, I felt it, a presence behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing just a few feet away was a figure, shrouded in darkness, its form barely visible in the fading light. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I took a step back, my legs trembling with fear, but the figure remained. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold and malevolent. This wasn't just a spirit. This was something far worse, something supernatural. The figure took a step forward, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble. The air grew thick with a dark energy, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of evil closing in around me. My body shook as I backed away, but the figure followed, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was toying with me. My mind raced with panic. I needed to leave, to get as far away from that cemetery as possible, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. The figure continued to advance, its form growing darker, more distorted, as if it were made of shadows. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a fallen headstone as the figure loomed closer. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in my ears, but I couldn't understand them. All I knew was that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It was something far darker, something ancient and filled with malevolence. Just as the figure was about to reach me, it vanished. The air returned to normal, and the oppressive energy lifted. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing, but the figure was gone. The cemetery was silent once more, but the memory of what I had seen was burned into my mind. I left the cemetery that night, but I've never been the same. I still don't know what killed Lucas, but I'm certain that whatever it wasn't of this world. The cemetery is cursed, filled with the lost souls of those who have disappeared. And I'm terrified that one day it will claim another victim. The third story is about the Cemetery of Shadows. There are places in the world that seem to have been forgotten by time, places where darkness lingers and the air itself feels wrong. The old cemetery at the edge of town was one of those places. It was tucked away in a forgotten corner, surrounded by dense woods that few dared to venture into. The cemetery had earned a reputation for being haunted, and locals avoided it like the plague. It was known for something far more sinister than ghostly apparitions, though. Over the years, people had gone missing in the area surrounding the cemetery, only to turn up days, weeks, or even months later, dead, and always within the cemetery grounds. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. The bodies were just there, lying peacefully among the graves, as though they had simply laid down and died. The local authorities had no explanation, and the cases remained unsolved mysteries. The stories fascinated me, though they terrified me as well. I had heard countless tales about paranormal encounters in the cemetery, whispers in the night, figures seen walking among the graves, and strange lights flickering in the distance. I knew I should have stayed away, but something about the place drew me in. I wanted to see it for myself, to find out if there was any truth to the stories. That's how I found myself standing at the entrance of the cemetery late one evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the headstones. The air was cold and still, and the woods around me were eerily silent. I felt a knot of unease tighten in my chest, but I pushed forward, determined to uncover the truth. As I walked among the graves, a sense of wrongness grew stronger. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every step I took echoed unnaturally through the stillness. The cemetery seemed larger than I remembered, stretching out in all directions, the headstones barely visible in the dim light. That's when I saw it. The shadow. It was standing near an old, crumbling mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery, its form barely discernible in the fading light. At first I thought it was just another gravestone, but then it moved. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow shifted, its form flickering like smoke, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the shadowy figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its arms hung limply at its sides. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, shifting silhouette that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a wave of chills washed over me. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath hanging in the air in front of me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The shadow took a step forward, its form rippling as it moved closer. Panic surged through me as I backed away, but the shadow followed, gliding silently over the ground. My heart raced as I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the earth. But no matter how fast I moved, the shadow was always just behind me, never making a sound. I reached the mausoleum and pressed my back against the cold stone, gasping for breath. The shadow had stopped, standing a few feet away, its form flickering in the darkness. I could feel its presence, oppressive and suffocating, as though the very air around me was turning to lead. This wasn't just a spirit. This was something far more dangerous. I could feel the darkness radiating from the shadow, something ancient and filled with evil. My body trembled as I realized I was dealing with something that wasn't of this world. The shadow moved again, its arms outstretched, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was like I was being pulled into a void, my thoughts clouding with fear as the shadow loomed closer. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a nightmare made real. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, a voice so soft I could barely make out the words. It wasn't coming from the shadow, it was coming from within the mausoleum. The voice was calling to me, beckoning me to come closer. My heart raced as I turned toward the stone structure, and for the briefest moment I saw something move inside. Another figure, pale and ghostly, standing in the shadows. My mind raced with panic. Was this another victim, someone who had disappeared just like the others? Or was it something worse, something sent to lure me deeper into the cemetery, to trap me forever? The shadow didn't wait for me to decide. It lunged forward, its dark form swirling around me like smoke, and I felt the cold grip of its presence wrapping around my throat. I gasped for air, struggling to break free, but the darkness was overwhelming, crushing me with its weight. Just as I thought it was over, the shadow released me. I stumbled backward, coughing and gasping for breath, my vision blurring as the world around me spun. The shadow had vanished, and the cemetery was silent once more. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting in the darkness, watching me. I left the cemetery that night, shaken to my core, but the experience has stayed with me ever since. The shadow wasn't just some ghost story told to scare people. It was real, and it was hunting those who dared to enter the cemetery. I've never gone back, and I never will. But even now, I can feel its presence lurking in the corners of my mind, like a dark cloud that refuses to lift. The cemetery remains a place of unsolved mysteries, where the dead don't rest and the living aren't safe. I'll never forget the shadow that nearly took me, and I know that one day, it will claim another victim.